I had been a German soldier in training for over a year when we realized that in the Wehrmacht we were destined to be human tools of Hitler's political policies and his lust for world power. My unit, the 109th Artillery Regiment, was with the 4th Army 19th Panzer Corps when we invaded Poland from Germany in the northwest. Our objective was not Warsaw, but rather Czestochowa. The date was September 1st, 1939, and as we know, it was the beginning of World War II. We were doing what we had been trained and equipped to do, support armoured forces and motorised infantry with field artillery support. We were well stocked with food, ammunition, clothing and essential supplies, and we had good weather and little resistance. My battery was permanently in action and fired many rounds into the enemy in support of the advancing army. Our assault was led by tanks and motorised infantry and was called Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War. It was swift and effective, and the Polish armed forces were soon overwhelmed. Poland surrendered on September 27th, just 4 weeks later. The success of our first battle certainly impressed us, and casualties in my unit were nil. Later, looking back after facing the troubles in Russia and Italy, I could not believe how easy it really was. There are several memories of the campaign that stand out in my mind. Although the weather was clear on our advance into Poland, the Polish heat was stifling, and the dust was thick. At times we were very thirsty, even when riding in vehicles, because we did not stop long enough to adequately replenish our water reserves, as we often gave much of it to the thirsty infantry we passed. I also remember seeing thousands of Polish refugees trying to flee eastward. Sometimes their numbers clogged the roads, and they had to be moved so that we could advance. Some had been killed by aircraft, perhaps our own or artillery fire. Otherwise, the Polish people did not hinder us or stand in our way. In the midst of confusion, fear and panic, they simply ignored us and stayed away from us. I also remember that we learned the words to the song Lili Marleen, which will never be forgotten by any German soldier. We were in Poznan, after the invasion of Poland, and heard the news of the surrender of Britain and France. Suddenly, no one was talking, and you could hear a pin drop. At that time, I think everyone. They had the feeling that a catastrophe was coming. We saw that image there, with all those guns and trucks all beautifully arranged, and over the loudspeakers the ultimatum was announced. What mixed emotions we had! It was one of the two most significant experiences I will always remember. The other was the in-depth reconnaissance that I discuss in the chapter on the Russian campaign. One memory I will never forget occurred at the end of the campaign in Poland. We were in a big field in front of us, a small hill, and suddenly a little girl came down and started dancing like in a ballet. My friends and I just watched her, and then she disappeared. It was almost mystical. There I was, sitting there happy that the battle was more or less over, and suddenly a little girl came out on a hill and started ballet dancing. I have no idea what the background was, but I still see it. I don't know if it was real or a figment of my imagination. I just remember seeing it. It must have been another harbinger for us, the illusion of victory, tempered by the practicality of a more realistic future. In France 1940, after a few weeks in Poland, the shortest and most decisive campaign in which I participated, my unit was sent to Czechoslovakia for training in the Carpathian Mountains, and later, in the spring of 1940, to the western part of Germany, on the border with Luxembourg and France, to prepare for the invasion of France and the Netherlands. This was the period after Britain and France declared war on Germany and became known as the Prank War, when fighting ceased, and the only action we heard was the hurling of epithets and propaganda between the lines at French soldiers. We were stationed behind the Siegfried Line, the German West Wall. All we were doing was training and enduring the worst weather Europe had experienced in years, which stopped all invasion plans, which Hitler was constantly postponing. My unit, like others, was under stress. We were anticipating a lot, but we were not sure what. In final preparations for the invasion, we were near Cologne, and then in the mountainous Eifel region, occupied by Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's Army Group A. On the 10th of May, we began to advance southwestward through Luxembourg and Belgium on our way to France. France was the army's objective, but with the massive German forces, not all units could attack directly into that country. We bypassed the French Maginot Line to the north, and would not see it until many weeks after we finished our campaign, and it was already pinned down. On this occasion, we fought under the command of the famous panzer leader, General Heinz Guderian. who had developed the philosophy of armoured and motorised warfare and had practised it in Poland. As far as I can remember, most of the time my regiment was assigned to Field Marshal Wilhelm List's 12th Army, Colonel General Ewald von Kleist's Panzer Group, and Kircher's 1st Panzer Division. We headed south, passing through Bastogne, Sedan and Reims, advancing rapidly but facing a strong resistance from the French troops. We skirted the Maginot Line to the north and reached Sedan about the 13th of May. After taking Sedan, my regiment stayed with Kircher, and we headed west and then northwest, leaving Paris several miles to the south and veering toward the Channel coast. Kircher's objective was Montreuil, on the Channel coast. We advanced through the Montcornet and Saint-Quentin areas. My unit was acting as a floating field artillery or army artillery regiment that was not permanently assigned to any particular division or corps, but in all cases was under someone's command. We were still assigned to Kircher when we arrived in the Calais region about the 21st of May. We had advanced exceptionally fast since the 10th of May. During all that time, we encountered only French troops. We did not see the British. We saw some enemy planes, but they had no effect on us. My regiment reached the outskirts of Dunkirk, near Gravelines, where, together with thousands of tanks, infantry vehicles, artillery pieces and German soldiers, we literally stopped dead in our tracks on the 24th of May. Hitler ordered a pause for all German forces and allowed the British and other Allied forces to retreat by sea to England. My unit never actually reached the Channel or Dunkirk, but we got close enough to fire with artillery. We later learned that over 300,000 Allied troops escaped to England. We didn't understand why we didn't advance and take them, but we couldn't understand it. And it became one of the main questions that came up during my time in the service. I believed that the German soldier didn't mind destroying them, as life was so much easier if no one fired, and we thought the French and British were finished anyway. We later came to understand that this was poor military judgment and a source of regret. 4 years later, when the enemy turned it back on us many times over the course of 2 days, Hitler allowed us to take Dunkirk, which by then had little value. After advancing to Dunkirk, we were reassigned to eastern France as part of the occupation and descended into the Loire Valley near Nantes, and finally settled at Reims. We were never far from the demarcation line dividing the country into occupied and unoccupied halves, and we learned that Paris was taken on the 14th of June. We wondered with some excitement if we would have a chance to see the city. Although the campaign was still going on and we were not part of it, France surrendered on the 22nd of June. France was beautiful at that time, and the wine was fantastic. I remember well the food and the wine, the cider, the liquor that we found in the houses in France. We had feasts, and we would get drunk. In fact, every day we would get a little drunk. I also practiced speaking French. The German propaganda was telling us that we had to go to France to feed the impoverished French population, which was dying from hunger. We were living in French houses, and there was so much food that we couldn't eat anymore. We knew the propaganda was a lie. Later, as a tourist, I visited the Maginot Line. We were well supplied with everything we needed. During the campaign, we did not meet any French women. In fact, the only French people we saw were refugees. When life began to return to normal in the occupation, it was different, and I can say that I enjoyed my time in France and some French people. My unit was in France for about half a year in a small town near Reims. Every weekend we would go to Reims in a few trucks, a beautiful and very cultivated place, and we had more or less the freedom to enjoy life. It was a nice respite for us. I visited Paris several times and was very impressed by the cafes, the wine and the Eiffel Tower, wondering if it had anything to do with the German mountains of the same name, where we had gathered our large forces for the launching of the invasion. The German High Command OKW formulated the idea of a German invasion of Britain, and we began to receive instructions on how to handle the weapons and equipment to get there. However, this dream faded with time. In early 1941 we were transferred directly to Poland to train for another invasion, this time of the Soviet Union. But quickly we could say we lost enthusiasm. Then, in 6 more months, we literally lost the feeling in our feet from the bitter cold of the coming months. Young men like me, would remember the pleasant times in France, which was undoubtedly the most stress-free period of my military life. It started snowing in October and never stopped, which drove me crazy in the flat areas where I was, because I could hear the wind carrying the snow day and night without stopping. After the campaign in France at the end of 1940, we moved to Poland near the Bug River to prepare for the Russian campaign. The Wehrmacht High General Command called it Operation Barbarossa, but for the private, the prospect was not so appealing, and therefore we were told nothing specific. This lack of information for rank and file had become customary, for what purpose I could never understand, as it kept us in the dark and did nothing to inspire us to work harder for the fatherland. The attack began in the early morning, around 3 o'clock in the morning, on the 22nd of June 1941, with an extremely heavy bombardment before the panzer assault. Our unit was part of the bombardment from firing positions along the front. The heavy sustained fire caused an incredibly uncomfortable level of noise. I also remember that the night was very short, lasting only several hours. At that time, there was a demarcation line between the Soviet and German partitions of Poland. The invasion actually started from the Bug River region near Brest-Litovsk into the Russian-occupied eastern part of Poland, rather than directly into the Soviet Union. Later, we managed to successfully enter the Soviet Union through Belarus. We were in the central section of Marshal Fedor von Bock's invasion forces, Army Group Center. My unit was still being employed as a fire department, and we were assigned as needed, usually to areas of heavy action. Of course, this is what sometimes makes it difficult to reconstruct the exact command structure of my unit or its location in each campaign or battle. We began the attack assigned to Feldmarschall Gerd von Kluge's 4th Army, and later were with General Hermann Hoth's 3rd Panzer Group at Smolensk, and with General Erich Heinrich's 4th Panzer Group before Moscow. I know that we reported to several famous panzer commanders in different campaigns, such as Guderian of the 2nd Panzer Group, General Erich Hoth and Hoth. We frequently ran into Guderian, whom we soldiers affectionately called Fawn in a Hurry. This reminds me of the large letter G, painted on all his panzer vehicles to proudly identify his unit. Panzer division leaders placed their initials on the rear of their tanks and vehicles. We crossed the Bug River north of Brest-Litovsk, which of course was within pre-war Poland, and advanced eastward. We participated in the battles along the Yellow Line near Minsk, the supply route from Minsk to Smolensk, the battles in the Aer and Barino forests near Bryansk, and the Battle of Smolensk. The fighting around Smolensk in July and August was the most intense and deadly I saw during the war. Russian soldiers captured at Smolensk were passing in front of us to the rear. They were much nastier and looked more ragged than any we had seen on the Western Front. I remember seeing Feldmarschall Kluge near Smolensk, giving orders, but for what I did not know. He was the highest-ranking officer I had ever seen in the field. For us soldiers, the appearance of such high-ranking officers was meaningless, as we had no idea what we were going to do next. I also remember seeing with amusement various signs erected by panzer tank troops along the roads leading from Smolensk to Moscow. About 350 kilometers from the front line in the Smolensk area, we began our first orderly withdrawal around the 1st of September. Officially, it was called a planned withdrawal and a correction of the front lines, and in the propaganda news, the sweet expression "correction of the front lines" was proclaimed as a victory. I suppose it was, but to me it was as much as that the Russians were seriously beating us, and we needed to regroup. By the first snowfall in October, we again tightened the yellow lines and took another step back. Sometimes we acted as forward observers in front of the infantry. I didn't like that because they would shoot at us, and all we had to shoot back were small arms. How long we acted as forward observers always depended on the situation. Sometimes we'd sit in forward observer positions for 1 or 2 weeks. With this situation began an AR, rear area communication problem, when we would talk to our commander in the rear. Our communication was very simple. We would start the situation with a single word, Schieße or bad, which was usually the case, and go from there. There was an unofficial, crooked way of reporting the situation up the line. If the situation was bad, you reported that it was Schieße, meaning the situation was very bad. Then when you reported it to your superior, he could not say the situation was very bad, so he would say it was serious, and so on at each level. Finally, when it was reported to the higher level, the situation had become a victory. This was my first practical experience in army command and communication, and in cultivating feedback in the hierarchy. We soldiers were powerless to change it or stop it. Who were we, and what could we know about the next day, or perhaps a few days later? Then we heard in the propaganda news victory in the correction of the defensive line Yela, which was east of Smolensk, and the huge losses we had inflicted damage to the enemy, but not a word was mentioned about a retreat, about the desperation of the situation, about the mental and emotional paralysis of the German soldiers. In short, again it was a victory, but we, on the front line, were retreating like rabbits in front of the fox. This metamorphosis of the truth, that it was all a victory, puzzled me and those of my comrades who dared to think. It took me about 25 years to understand this ugly phenomenon when I began to study the psychology of communications and also the biological limitations of communication. My unit's records indicate some success of our artillery in stopping attacks on the Yela line, which is definitely interesting. However, we soldiers did not know how successful we had been. The nature and lack of accuracy of artillery fire sometimes means that you don't always realize if you have hit your target, or if a random shot has caused casualties or damage to equipment or structures. Sometimes the forward observer may report that you have hit this or that, but artillery art is indiscriminate. When you move forward, you can get a sense of your success or lack thereof, but if you move back, you realize that the enemy keeps moving forward no matter what you do to prevent it. We would definitely discover this later near Moscow. I remember well the retreat from the Yela line. We had exhausted almost all of our artillery ammunition and did not provide adequate support against enemy artillery batteries, resulting in a constant amount of Soviet artillery fire and casualties in our ranks. This showed that we were not welcome there. I remember we didn't get a resupply of shells until days later when the front stabilized. It was completely dark, and we tried to get back to the main front line. Every truck, every tractor with its gun and every soldier was on his OWN. I was riding a motorcycle with a sidecar, an NSU, but no one knew where the battery commander was, and I suppose he did not know where his guns were either. He participated in the retreat like any private, with no organization, no communication, and no command. This was perhaps the fiercest battle I remember in the whole war. Our problems with the weather began before the onset of winter, which starts very early in Russia, when the first snow fell in October. I could only think of Napoleon's fate. We had problems with the early snow, and when it started to melt, the so-called roads were more like a swamp, and it kept raining. These were conditions we had not encountered in Poland or France. I was again assigned to drive the motorcycle with sidecar, and had to ride about 60 miles with a message. It took me a week to make the round trip. I almost had to push the motorcycle the whole way, unimaginable that this was before the onset of winter, not spring. In that interim period, food trucks were stuck on the swampy roads, and there seemed to be an emphasis on delivering ammunition and fuel so we could keep fighting. On military maps, we compared Russian roads to our Autobahnen or Yankee asphalt highways, and in Russia, we were sinking in mud. On Russian roads, if you could call them that, we were unable to move in an organized way. The smells of danger were everywhere. Enemy guns, planes, artillery shells, and a sound that was known only in Russia, Stalin's organ. The Russians had a Stalin organ rocket launcher that fired 8 rockets at a time. This was the most shocking and frightening thing I ever encountered. The only good thing about the Stalin organ was the beautiful fan of smoke that appeared at the rear that gave away its position. We could do something to respond if only we had enough ammunition. The sounds were terrible, terrible. We encountered the Katyusha for the first time after Smolensk. For a long time it seemed that the rockets would never end. Another danger was coming. I will never forget it. We were on the Smolensk defense line and we were told that we were going to capture Moscow by December 1941. There was a German intelligence officer, General Galen, who supposedly predicted that the Russians were mobilizing a new tank corps behind the Urals, using the new T-34 tank. The T-34 would soon come for us and lead the Russian counter-offensive in December, driving us out of Moscow. Our men panicked about the T-34. It was superior to our tanks and anti-tank guns. We knew we had to move when we saw a T-34. It was a clear message. Our advance on the centre of the Moscow front began in early October. With a bit of luck, our forces defeated the Russians in the Bryansk area, and we followed, moving forward very slowly. We advanced along the roads between Smolensk and Moscow, passing through the Kuga and Obninsk areas. To the best of my recollection, we were assigned most of the time to General Herner's 4th Panzer Group. By the end of November, our advance had stalled due to a combination of factors: weather, temperature, supply, fatigue, and the Red Army. which was unwilling to let us get any closer. We saw the streetcars on the outskirts of Moscow, but we were not firing any shells toward Moscow. It was too far away. Of course, we didn't realize it at the time, but our army had stopped its assault. What we did know was that we had to prepare our positions and start preparing for the extreme cold. From that point on, we would have to fight to hold what we had, or to keep the enemy from crushing us as we retreated westward. At that time, the German army, famous for its panzers and motorized forces, was operating very erratically due to numerous mechanical problems. Some motorized units were no longer mobile, no thanks to the Russians, but to the weather. We were also dependent on horse-drawn vehicles to carry supplies from distant railroads because of extremely cold temperatures, often below -30 degrees Celsius or about -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Many trucks, some of our guns and other vehicles developed cold breaks on the leaf docks. They just didn't work. About 30% of the leaf springs on our trucks broke. If one broke at the rear, the truck lost its braking ability and would not stop. The German army began in a hurry to set up truck repair shops for the springs, but we did not have enough material or steel of the right quality to make reliable springs. We started the Moscow offensive with deteriorated equipment and lost a lot of that. I remember that our guns on the panzers were all towed by vehicles. The horse-drawn artillery belonged to ordinary infantry divisions. During this cold, no truck would start. But if a unit was able to capture somewhere along the way a Russian truck, those bastards were so simple that you could fix the carburetor and make a fire under the engine. Then you could start the truck, and as soon as the Russian truck was running, we'd start towing the German truck. The Russian trucks were an ancient design. There wasn't a single bolt you could remove without the vehicle coming apart. It was the most primitive design imaginable, about like a Model A Ford you could imagine. But the bastard would always start. We were trying to capture Russian trucks as much as we could. It saved our lives. No soldier could fathom the idea of an offensive in such miserable conditions. The spirit of the troops was also below zero, as you know from what you have read. The wind was blowing almost all the time. We never officially received winter clothing and could not understand why they did not give it to us. Our men received pieces of clothing in the mail, mostly socks. We improvised by using newspapers inside shoes and wore several T-shirts and undergarments at the same time. We also tried making boots out of straw and rope to cover the shoes. Our clothes became full of lice, which added to the misery of the cold. Our skin was oily and irritated, and we dared not sweat too much if that was possible, as it gave us an unpleasant chill in the wind. In our battery, only 2 of 4 guns and about half of the ammunition trucks were mobile. Of course, being a hopeful engineer, I learned my first lesson about the difference between performance and reliability. Performance is great as long as the mousetrap works. There was so much interesting confusion that even the officers began to ask the question, what nonsense is this to start an attack with units whose trucks don't move, trucks with cold brakes and no springs? The units were not ready for combat because of the lack of transportation. The faithful industrial horses had a hard time in the cold and could not pull half tracks. The glorious leader Hitler had this idea for the last attack of the year, to take Moscow. He was absolutely crazy, but of course no one dared to say so, and everyone said, "Yes, my Führer." At times, visibility was reduced to practically zero due to the miserable blowing snow. If we were a little further back, we were housed in a village, which was really a collection of a few peasant farms. It was our best way to survive the cold, because we couldn't dig or build shelters in the frozen ground, except rudely by blasting. Each farmhouse consisted of 2 rooms. One had a big stove and bunk beds to sleep on top of it, and the other room was for a goat, cow, pig, and the barn. We had to take things out and make our own place inside. If I had the watch, I couldn't stay outside for more than 20 minutes. After 20 minutes, the next guy would come out to relieve you, and then he would freeze. I'm not sure what we were supposed to guard. Not even a Russian soldier would be around on those nights. It was just unimaginable. But the interesting thing was that every farmhouse still had a religious icon, mostly behind a curtain. Some German soldiers would remove the icons if the house was unoccupied. Occasionally, we would take one away, but mostly we left them there. If a Russian was in the house, no German would touch the icons. We had no idea how poor Russian peasants could be until we started living their lifestyle. Their farms were just basic shelters. Never in my life I have seen such primitive buildings as in Smolensk. It was simply unbelievable. We felt that we were in a different world. My impression of Russia was that it was absolutely desolate, confined in its own domain, and should remain there. I often wondered what the hell I was doing there, why we needed Russia, what good it could do for us. It was bad enough during the previous summer, when we had to sleep in the open air. Then, when winter forced us to seek shelter indoors, we saw poverty more directly. Russian peasants had no equivalent in the Western world, except perhaps in a poor farmer's yard. So we would cover ourselves with whatever we had to try to keep a little bit warmer. We used blankets, tablecloths, curtains, anything that would provide a layer of warmth. We weren't beyond taking boots and dead soldiers' clothes from both sides. When I was inside, there was little to do except read and improve my chess game, and I tried not to think about the cold until it was my turn to be on guard duty outside. I don't think Stalin's scorched earth policy was strictly followed by those officials who were ordered to carry it out, unless someone wanted to keep warm for a while. Even the followers of the Soviet collectivist state wanted to survive, and self-destruction had little survival value. If we burn it, guess what? The Germans can't have it now, and we can't have it later. There comes a point when even the fanatics begin to use their brains. I saw many Russian peasants, and they did not treat us inconsiderately. They were certainly dirty, unattractive, and looked like the pictures I had seen of ignorant, poor farmers from the time of the Tsars, with shirts tied at the waist and big hairy hats. I remember fugitive peasants passing through our lines, presumably from the front. They were human beings in spite of their appearance. We offered them the so-called warmth of our house, which we had borrowed from other farmers for a while. Only on a few occasions did they try to steal something from us, but never our weapons. However, their personal habits went back to life even long before the first Tsar. We could not believe it. They used their own pants as toilets, and after 5 minutes in the room, we had to run out because we couldn't stand the smell despite the cold. I can't describe it. We tried to sleep on straw or dirty wooden beds or whatever we could find, and discarded any thought of comfort. We were content to be happy to wake up every morning and still be alive. To subsist, we would sometimes go into the woods and try to find mushrooms if we could find any. Each soldier carried a bag with him to carry potatoes and onions. We would try to dig them up wherever we could and then roast them. We didn't have butter, so sometimes we'd put them in a pan with a little water over the fire. At least they would get warm. Lighting fires and keeping them burning also required constant searches for things to burn. For a while the supply system completely collapsed, and we were on our own. What little there was to plunder we took. Animals did not live long. If an animal or bird was nearby, we immediately grabbed it for food. Blizzards with blowing and accumulating snow made it very difficult to find things to forage on, including wood. We couldn't get fresh water from wells, as the contents were frozen and contaminated, so we had to resort to melting snow. A luxury that at least was an inexhaustible supply during the December 1941 retreat from the Moscow suburbs, or the relocation of the front. At that time, I suffered frostbite on my right leg while riding my motorcycle delivering messages. I froze my leg a little, not too much, but enough to be recognized. There was no way around it. I was wearing all the clothes I could, and I wasn't going very fast due to the road conditions. I think what caused the frostbite was contact with the frozen machine and being exposed too long. It happened about 3 weeks before Christmas. Fortunately, I was recalled from the front for treatment. I was lucky that my case was severe enough to release me from the front for a while. However, I must say that my leg has bothered me ever since. The 109th Artillery Regiment was relieved by another unit and withdrawn just before Christmas, 1941. We had to leave almost all of our guns, vehicles and equipment in place because we had little means of transporting them. When we left, we were sent home on trains, and although we received no new clothes and hardly any rations on the trip, at least the wagons were warmer than the peasant houses and smelled better. We were able to get some sleep sitting in moderately comfortable seats. At that time, I got my first permission to study for a semester at the Technical University of Vienna. Again, I was very lucky, and it was a nice break while recovering from frostbite, and a joyful reward for having spent more than 2 years away on campaigns or preparing for them. It was my first time at the university, from where I would eventually receive my degree. It was a pleasant and beautiful experience. However, my thoughts were with our comrades, who at that time were constantly being pushed back from Moscow, never to see it again. After the December retreat, in which my regiment lost everything, we were withdrawn from the Eastern Front and returned to Czechoslovakia to regroup, train, and be reconstituted with new recruits and equipment. I rejoined them in the late spring of 1942, after I completed my semester. Observing the developments on the Eastern Front while we were in Czechoslovakia, and trying to determine the real truth from the half-truths or lies that my friends and I came to certain conclusions. Although we soldiers were not deserting, by then the war had taken a turn against Germany. We speculated privately, very privately, about the future. Looking back now from my perspective, I strongly suspect, but cannot prove, that the calamity in the winter of 1941, not 1942, in front of Moscow, decided the war for us. German industry could not replace the winter losses before the offensives in 1942, which finally led to the catastrophic surrender in January 1943 at Stalingrad. The losses of soldiers, machines, and equipment in Moscow were irreplaceable. I have never seen anything written on this point, even more than 2 decades later. In retrospect, this led to my extreme thesis that an army cannot lose more in a day than industry can produce or replace in a day. I presented my thesis a few years ago, before the end of the Cold War, in a global war game in which industry experts with computer models assured us that all losses could easily be made up in 2 or 3 years. 2 or 3 years. What enemy will wait that long? Certainly not the Red Army. There are specific moments in my 6-month experience in the Soviet Union, from June 22nd through the end of December 1941, that I will never be able to forget or describe well. Perhaps the most dramatic occurred in Russia, when the assault unit we were supporting organized an offensive reconnaissance mission, with an artillery battery of 4 10-centimeter guns and a battalion of infantry motorcycles. This offensive reconnaissance mission was ordered to advance beyond our position to ascertain the enemy strength and return to report back to headquarters. Our group, with me as a member, crossed our own infantry lines with the order to advance as far as possible before encountering resistance. From the moment we crossed the lines, we knew we were completely alone. Nobody was talking. I remember the infantrymen looking at us, from the battery, as if we were crazy. Suddenly I felt that I was alive and wanted to be alive, but at the same time I had the feeling that we were walking into a death trap. It is extremely difficult to describe the feeling I had at times like that. Another such moment occurred in 1939 in Poland, when we heard about the British and French ultimatum concerning German involvement in Poland. Those were the 2 moments when nobody was talking and everybody had his own ideas. I don't know what everyone was thinking. It also had the quietness of a death trap. I will never forget these absolutely disturbing images. When the retreat from Moscow began, I felt it was the end. However, the motto of our service in Russia was that you had to keep a positive attitude. Still, everyone who left with me from my regiment was happy and morale was quite high. Most of us had survived and would fight somewhere else. One thing that is hard for me to understand, and for everyone, was the wariness of the American troops. When we pulled out of the valley leading to Monte Cassino, we couldn't understand why we weren't being followed by American troops. We turned around and no one was behind us. There were no weather problems preventing the US troops from moving forward. We didn't stop to find out why. After leaving the Soviet Union and completing our reconstitution and training in Czechoslovakia. In 1942, our regiment was transferred to a camp in Osnabrück, Germany. There we received many new recruits for basic training, without weapons. At this place we all had to undergo a medical examination. We thought it was routine, but it turned out to be much more important. It was a fitness for duty evaluation in a tropical climate. Shortly thereafter, our unit was split up. The men fit for tropical service, including myself, were transferred to the newly reconstituted Artillery Battalion Africa, Artillery Abteilung 557. Those who were not fit for tropical service, which included several of my friends and comrades from previous years, were relocated to the former Artillery Abteilung 109, which was redesignated Artillery Regiment Großdeutschland. This former 109th unit was eventually completely destroyed in the Battle of Stalingrad. My new unit, the 557th, began wearing the North African desert uniform of the Africa Corps Division. We were sent by ship to Naples, Italy, in the summer of 1942, where we entered an acclimatization camp to get used to the Mediterranean climate. Needless to say, This change of climate was very welcome after having been in Russia. Those of us who had been through that nightmare definitely felt we had earned it. The acclimatization camp was located around a sports stadium near the ancient Roman city of Pompeii. Surprisingly, this camp turned out to be my first POW camp after the war. I never imagined that I would return there in those conditions. In Naples, we enjoyed the beauty of the city, its women, Marsala wine, espresso, and our camp around the sports stadium. The situation was much more relaxed and less stressful compared to the Eastern Front. It reminded me somewhat of my earlier days in Reims. My time in the acclimatization camp turned out to be tremendously enjoyable. I was assigned to lead a gunfire calculation group called the Rantrop. These were the specialists who measured the location of the guns like a surveyor and calculated the elevations and corrections needed for the firing adjustment, taking into account factors such as wind, temperature and others. This was my first and only assignment with leadership authority. Would I have been forgiven for my shady past? I think the answer is that I was one of the few seasoned veterans. In my group, I had two new recruits, Dr. August, nicknamed Gustl, a lawyer from Steyr, Austria, and Dr. Lothar Kelt, the curator of the National Museum of Art in Vienna. Both were much older than me. Unfortunately, Lothar died in the Italian campaign, and Gustl died of old age about 10 years after the war. The three of us explored Naples, Capri, Pompeii, and Salerno. Gustl was an expert on wine, espresso, and music, while Lothar explored every available art site, from churches to excavations. I entertained them with stories about Italian racing cars and motorcycles. We had complete trust in each other. We shared stories about our families and heretical political views. We enjoyed Italy, its wine, its climate, and learned Italian as much as we could. While most of our German comrades complained bitterly about the lack of cleanliness, lack of traffic discipline, and other customs of southern Italy, we simply enjoyed Italy, the sun, and the absence of snow. The fun in Italy, at least around Naples, ended for me about October 1942. I fell seriously ill with jaundice, along with about a dozen other soldiers due to eating Neapolitan seafood. Despite my precautions, this time they failed me. We were taken by hospital train to a hospital in Bavaria. It was there that I had an encounter with a bright young doctor. I assumed he was an expert in medical efficiency. He told me that we should use the time of recovery from jaundice to take care of your varicose veins. What could I say? So I got my injections, but the young doctor failed to inject into my veins, and the injection went into the muscle, causing me to bruise so badly I couldn't walk. I could have complained about the doctor's incompetence, which would have affected his career, but I kept my mouth shut and got 4 months' leave to recuperate at home. After the hospital, the doctor, I suppose, invented a reason that would not be detrimental to his career. Then I had the opportunity to take a second semester at the Technical University of Vienna. In 4 years in the army, I suffered from frostbite and jaundice, but not from gunshot wounds. I realized that 1942 had been the first full year since 1938, when I entered the army, that I had not fought in a battle. It was a beautiful time because of personal reasons, exciting because of the opportunity to learn, but also shocking because of the news from the front at Stalingrad. Most of the former members of the 109th Artillery Regiment were at Stalingrad, including my best friend from the first day in the army, Franzi Mayer. He was an only son and was engaged to a girl in a small village in the Rhineland, near K. Our unit was in barracks before the campaign in France, when the German army at Stalingrad surrendered in February 1943. About 95,000 German soldiers fell into captivity, but years later, after the end of the war, about 5,000 returned home. My friend Franzi was not among them, and soon after, his parents died of a broken heart. His fiancée, whom I visited almost 50 years later, married an invalid war veteran. We didn't talk about my friend. We simply looked into each other's eyes and understood each other. They were eyes that could not shed tears. I had more friends like Franzi during the war who did not make it, but none as dear as he. About the end of March 1943, I returned to my unit, the 1st Battery of the 557th Artillery Battalion. It was located near the airport in Palermo, Sicily, and I got there by train, boat and truck. The 1st Battery was all that was left of the 557th Battalion. The 2nd Battery had been detached to form the Africa Corps and had arrived in Tunisia, North Africa, but unfortunately lost a battle after landing and ended up in an American POW camp in a very organized fashion. The 3rd Battery met a much worse fate and still lies at the bottom of the Mediterranean after being torpedoed in transport from Sicily to Tunisia. Only the 1st Battery survived and returned to be the nucleus of a new 557, which first operated in Sicily and then in Italy until the bitter end. From that moment on, I felt doomed to live in the German army. We prepared all our artillery positions in the direction of the Trapani and Marsala area on the west coast, where the German army expected the American landing. However, the Americans were careless enough to land in the south, in the Gulf of Gala, and the British in the eastern area, at Catania and Syracuse, practically behind our front, where we had established our artillery positions, but miles away. When they landed behind us, the date was the 10th of July, 1943, and we began to move frantically toward MSA to cross the strait into Italy. The Italian army collapsed like glass and left much of the fighting to defend their territory to the Germans. Also, had we been able to stay in Sicily, the wine in Marsala would have been much better than the wine in Salerno, which was the area we were headed for, and where we would be when the Allies made their landings in the boot of Italy. In fact, the Americans, for the most part, bypassed Marala. Unfortunately, we never made it to North Africa, so goodbye tropical acclimatization. The history of the German forces there was not good either, fast forward backwards, and one thing to remember is that the German army's combat positions and tactics in Europe had changed radically. We were no longer attacking armoured forces, as when we invaded France. Now we had become defenders in Sicily and Italy. We fought a defensive war which meant adjusting our lines, practically always retreating. This was also our first time fighting the Americans, and we wondered what they would be like and how we would react. As soon as we positioned our guns, it appeared that Allied advances were forcing us to withdraw quickly. Both the German and Italian armies were being pressed by Allied advances to the northeast, in the direction of the one obvious place to go, MSA. A bottleneck was forming. In a sense, the Italian army was getting in our way, as some of their soldiers wanted to surrender to the Americans. The Sicilians also hindered us, and after a few days of fighting, we knew that the most sensible thing to do was to evacuate the island. I believe our route took us through the Mazzara Mountains toward Bulgaria and Termini, then along the Tyrrhenian coast. Our unit suffered only a few casualties, and I doubt we inflicted many ourselves. Some days we advanced faster and covered more distance than others, but we never stayed in one place long enough to mount a firm defence. Symbolic resistance is a term I learned that became closely identified with our efforts. I believe the mountains and terrible roads hindered the Americans as much or more than our guns. Our commanders, and certainly soldiers at our level, felt that there was little point in trying to hold on to Sicily. We preferred to cross into Italy, where we could reorganize and build up better defences and stay longer. We had to retreat very quickly to MSA, and once there, we boarded ships, including landing craft, to transport our men, weapons and equipment across the 3 miles or so of the Strait of Messina to Calabria in southern Italy. We stopped to fire on the Allies at Messina after reaching Italy, but reorganized and advanced immediately northward toward the Bay of Naples. We dodged many air raids, along the coastal road. So much for today's video. Remember to subscribe and leave your like so we keep bringing content for all of you. See you next time.